Hey, so I promise that every video won't start with like 5 minutes of pretentious, preachy designer talk, but I guess bear with me one more time. This particular prototype, I think, needs a little bit of clarification and background for it to make any sense at all, or to understand how it fits into the bigger picture of The Sims. So I really wanted to talk about two things, and that was how Sims make their own decisions traditionally in The Sims, and then how neighborhoods or worlds have worked across the history of The Sims a little bit. I'll try to do as quickly as possible though, or you can just skip ahead to the prototype and maybe it'll make sense anyway. I don't know. We'll see. So the way Sims make decisions traditionally, when you're not queuing up directed actions for them and things like that, is a really simple logic. Basically, they look at all the possible actions across all of the available objects, and then they score all of those actions. So it could be like flush the toilet, use the toilet, sleep in the bed, make a sandwich. Could be anything. Could socializing, talk to your kids. All of those things are actions that the Sims consider. They score all of those actions. They look at things like how far away the object is, how much total satisfaction they can get, how much time it's going to take them to get that satisfaction. They do some simple math across all of that, and then they choose one of the better ones. I'll probably do a video down the line that kind of digs into why we don't choose the best one, but for now that's enough. And essentially, what that does is that makes things seem coherent, and that's very important for this prototype. It doesn't necessarily make them smart. In fact, in the case of Sims, we don't necessarily want them to be smart, but it does make them coherent, and at the very least, they're retroactively coherent, which is extra important for this particular prototype. That is to say that, like, if you come back, or you're looking around your game and you see that your Sim is sleeping, you can look at their motives and be, oh, okay, well, now I understand that their motive is really low. So, or they're making a sandwich. It's like, oh, well, their hunger is really low and I didn't satisfy it. So that makes sense, right? Retroactively, it's coherent. It makes sense. The second thing that I think is important for understanding this prototype, at least for context anyhow, is how neighborhoods have traditionally worked. So prior to Sims 3, and for the most part, this is how Sims 4 works as well, but definitely in Sims 1 and in Sims 2, the neighborhood was basically a save game directory, and your houses or your lots were save games in that directory. They get represented in this cool way, which is a nice little sleight of hand to make it seem like there's a world full of all of your Sims, but you were only playing actively the one that you were playing. The rest of it, nothing was happening. They were just files on your hard drive. They didn't advance. They didn't move forward. There's some little tiny exceptions that got added in Sims 2 a little bit, and were a bit of inspiration here, but there wasn't really a system there. The game would occasionally, in Sims 1 and Sims 2, the game would occasionally pull Sims from other lots, other houses, other save games, basically, to use as NPCs. And it was a neat little head fake. So like, or townies, as they're colloquially known, in The Sims. And that meant that, you could be playing one household and all of a sudden one of the kids from that household would show up at your house and maybe play with your kids, which was really interesting. And it gave it, again, it's a magic trick. It made it feel like it was larger and the things were more interconnected than they were. It could lead to weird crosstalk. Like, I remember way back when I was playing Sims 1, my girlfriend was also playing Sims 1 on the same PC. And at some point, one of the Sims from her household came by my house when I was playing. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. So then I started a relationship with this woman from my girlfriend's game. And then we fell in love. My Sim and her Sim. I'm assuming my girlfriend and I were already in love. Anyway, it was a long time ago. But then we had a relationship. I invited her to move in and she moved in with me. And now, to keep things coherent and to prevent duping and stuff like that, the game actually made that make a little bit of sense. Like, it emptied her house out. It gave me the funds from that house. It didn't transfer objects, and her Sim became part of my save game. So then when my girlfriend loaded up her house the next day, it was empty and her Sim was gone, which I thought was hilarious. She didn't think that so much, but that was a little bit of the inspiration for what we ended up doing in Sims 3. In Sims 3, we wanted to create, or at least experiment with creating this much larger open world where everything was live and interconnected and simulating. We weren't sure how to make that all make sense, or, if all of your save games were no longer saved, they were evolving. That was a pretty weird, brain-breaking concept. So we wanted to try it out. This prototype that we're going to take a look at was our core effort into that. Let's take a look. Alrighty. So what we have here is the story progression prototype from early in Sims 3 development. This prototype was not actually created by me. This prototype was created by one of the other designers on the team, Ray Mazza. He was one of the gameplay engineers and designers on Sims 2, and then was part of the core design team on Sims 3. So what we're looking at is a neighborhood, even though it may not look like it yet. Each of these orange boxes is a lot, a house, a household, and they have street addresses, I guess. And when you can zoom out and see, okay, the actual scale of it, there's quite a few of them, just to represent, the actual number of lots that we thought we might have in a Sims 3 neighborhood. There are also little yellow boxes. You can see one poking out here that are Sims, and I'll show you what that does in a second. So the core idea here, though, well, let's get the Sims moved in first. So we're going to kick time forward just a little bit. And now you'll see it start simulating, and the Sims will just start moving in. Right now they're moving into houses. They move in, they're all single, but then they start meeting each other, forming relationships, and you can see them even moving in to other houses, like moving in with each other. And over time, we'll keep this going. About a month has passed now. They'll start having kids and whatnot. Let's stop them for a second and talk through what's happening. So the thing we realized during early Sims 3 was that to simulate this open world, we might be able to take advantage of what we knew from the basic simplistic Sims behavior and what I just described earlier. And the realization that we had was that perhaps the Sims, instead of taking actions like use the toilet, make a sandwich, what if we flipped that upside down and we said that the entire neighborhood was choosing actions. So instead of choosing to use a toilet, we'd look at it more holistically and we'd say, okay, well, based on what this Sim is, what should be happening to them? They should be getting a job. They should be getting promoted. They should be having a baby. This person is their enemy, so maybe they steal their girlfriend, whatnot. But instead of them scoring actions like use toilet, we scored actions like get a job, get promoted, get married, have a baby. And we choose them very, very similarly based on how likely it is, each action is. So how likely is it that you're going to quit your job as a policeman versus get promoted as a policeman? If you get promoted as a policeman, rather than the way we normally would do it, which was, you'd build skills and then you'd get ahead as a policeman, for these NPCs, simulated NPCs, we just say, no, you just became a policeman. And when you became a policeman, we go back and patch up your skills to make sure that everything was coherent. The end result was that if a player went to go to any one of these houses, there'd be a fully fleshed out person or people there, and then they would in turn behave as what we had told them at a macro level they were. So what that means in the context of this prototype is that we can zoom into, let's zoom in here to Betty and Bob. Betty and Bob have 2 kids, Andy and Jeff. Betty is a romance sim. She's neat. She's placid. She loves the outdoors, but she's a little clumsy. She's a level 2 scientist. I don't know about a clumsy scientist, if that's a good plan, but such as it is. Bob is a popularity sim. He's sickly, though. He talks to himself, but he's an outgoing party animal. And he's a teacher, so that's probably going to lead to some good stories. His kids, Jeff is a family toddler. Andy is also a family-oriented toddler who's a close talker, but he's placid just like his mom. The objects here are, this did not make it anywhere into The Sims 3, but I think it's an interesting idea, was that these were the objects that they own. So they must have 4 beds because there's 4 of them. They have it, in this case, that's a pretty cramped single bathroom that they have. And the numbers tell you what quality level of furniture it is. So as they get richer or succeed, we want to maybe level up their furniture. So you go back to their house after a month, they got promoted, or maybe Betty got promoted in the science career through this same system. So now they have nicer furniture. Or maybe even we added a computer, or we added some lab equipment. But all of those choices would be made at this macro level, not Betty running around her house. These little green bags are actually how much money they have. Again, obviously very simulated. You could also go back and see what relationships they have. So if I pick Betty here, I can see she has obviously she has relationship to, her family, but oh, she has a relationship over here as well. So if we go over here and check this dude out, oh dear, Betty loves Brian. That's scandalous. Brian lives alone. And he has probably just a bookcase so that he can study. But if he's using a bookcase to build skills, he might be very close. He's a knowledge sim, so that makes sense, actually. Again, the coherence that and whatnot. But that also means that he's maybe more of a connection to Betty, and that was factored into the scoring. So let's go back to Betty, and let's take a look at what's happened to her so far in her life. So these are the levels. If you were looking at a Sim's history, like his behavior, you'd see things like use the toilet, made a sandwich, whatever. But here you see these macro level things. So you see things like Betty, she moved into a new home. She met Liz. She met Bob. She fell in love with Bob. She became friends with Bob in that order. Sometimes that happens. Not saying it's necessarily the most healthy thing, but it happens. It took a little bit. It looks like it took a few days in this compressed world for Bob to fall in love with Betty, but they did fall in love with each other. But then Betty fell in love with Brian, and then a few days later, Bob proposed to her. Betty said yes, and I don't know what Betty's plan is, but she said yes, even though she knows she's in love with Brian. And then Bob moved in with Betty, and then Betty kept making friends, and so on. She got promoted to a level 2 scientist. That's awesome. And then they got married, maybe because they could afford to do it now. I don't know. And then you can see where they had babies and so on. Now, all of these things were scored, honestly, very, very similarly to the way we scored using a toilet or making a sandwich. It was just that the actions had much greater scope, and they were happening when you weren't looking. But, like I said, now, when you go to visit Betty, Bob lives there, and there are 2 kids there. And Bob and Betty have a relationship that makes sense. And if you ever were to go to a party at Betty and Bob's house, or invite both Betty and Brian over to your house, the person that she also is in love with, then Betty might start flirting with Brian. And if Bob were there, he'd get upset. Just because that higher level state, that macro state, their relationships, their jobs, their furnishings, those things were decided in this outer level of simulation. And that turned out to be very powerful. It also, just as a final footnote, it allowed us to do a lot of things from a game design perspective that might not have been as trivial or as organic. And that was if, for example, things like we need more Sims in the neighborhood. Maybe the neighborhood is gotten too small, too many people have died. Well, that could affect the scoring of these macro actions. So all Sims might suddenly have a greater chance of having babies, also modulated by whether they're a family-oriented Sim or whatnot, but they might choose to they might have a baby. The system might have a baby for them, basically, if the population was too low. Or if the population is too high, we might suddenly have people dying more often of accidents and things like that in an extreme case, or just of, old age, and their likelihood of, how old the Sim can survives to might be reduced because we need to clean house a little bit. Same thing for pretty much any macro attribute of the neighborhood or macro characteristic of the neighborhood that we could push through a system like this. We could have it sort of organically ebb and flow, but still maintain appropriate levels for a playable game. So this turned out to be very powerful. It wasn't perfect because there were issues with, your own house is simulating. Where you wanted basically these houses to be save games like we just discussed earlier. But in the end, the core of this, I think, was very, very powerful. And in its simplicity and sort of this hierarchical simulation at a weird scale that I don't think you see in a lot of games. And that is story progression in The Sims 3. See you again soon.